Hi. I thought I'd have a little chat today, which is kind of inspired by two young women. The story of two young women that's been very much in the news. One is Disha Ravi, who has been arrested under very, very harsh sedition laws for participating in the protest, in the farmers' protest against the laws that the government has passed. And the young woman who was elected a few days ago as the first Indian woman president of the Oxford Union in the UK at Oxford University, and who has had to resign um, apparently yesterday on charges of racism. And I first want to talk about Disha Ravi because, I mean, uh, there's no doubt about it that if you hear about any person who's an activist, a young activist, and who has been basically accused of collaborating on some kind of toolkit, which is associated with some organization abroad, which the present government in India believes is anti-India or sympathizes with separatism. And you're slamming her in jail. It's not just that you're putting a case on her, but you've put her in jail. And there's you're putting her lawyers and her colleagues in jail. And it's just it's very scary, and everybody has written about it. But I want to say this, that the kind of heft that this new type of activism brings to the table is as strong, is as in terms of power. It just in terms of you're collaborating with these huge international networks. You've got the money they bring. It's funded by these people who people who are billionaires and millionaires in Western countries, billionaires and millionaires in dollars. They're not just in rupees, who put their money behind it. They've all got foundations where there's a battery of professional people who are trained in basically lobbying for your cause. That's not a fair fight either. And I think that there needs to be a conversation around the fact that the face of activism today is it's a machine. It's very different from spontaneous grassroots movements that come from the lived experience of people, which is shared within a society between the generations. All this climate change stuff. This whole this notion of computer algorithm taking out, the supercomputer has given a projection for what the global climate is going to be, assuming current levels of industrial growth and activity. And based on that, you have a whole a bunch of people deciding that they are now committed, to activism in this cause. This comes from a language, an experience, a culture, and an ecosystem that is a very far cry from the very personal, intimate, local, and spontaneous, organic type of politics that constitutional rights were really sort of the context in which they were conceived. Constitutional rights exist in a democratic scheme so that an individual is allowed to fight for his or her particular rights in his or her particular case, and not become, at least not without being given a fair chance to object, not become the victim or the collateral damage, or to be ignored of a policy, which is applied, on a broad level, which is what this is what lawmaking by the legislative arm ultimately is. You have a policy which tends to look upon questions in a community-wide manner. And even if it begins, with individual problems, the laws apply generally across the community and are justified in terms of, a balance of competing interests society-wide. But recognizing that this can trample on individual personal interests, and that ultimately the individual is the fundamental unit of a democratic society. Recognizing this, these fundamental human rights were set up. And I do believe that is a very precious right. That's really what makes life worth living, even when democracies just rumble along in a ramshackle way and don't always achieve the ends and the lofty ideals that they are meant to. And but that's a very far cry from this big machine. And I personally noticed this when I encountered the whole child welfare system that I keep writing and speaking about. And I was so taken aback by how, you had this whole setup, the infrastructure, these laws had been put in place from 2006 onwards in India, basically by, a bunch of high-profile feminist activists and women's groups workers. You could count the number of these people on your fingers. I don't even think all the fingers of both hands would count. It's 9 or 10 people, and each of them is backed by a huge organization, huge amounts of money, and they are the voice, and because there's been this kind of professionalization of so many social issues, they are the last word, the experts and the last word, and anybody who's trying to present an alternative point of view, who's not an expert, is not even invited to the table. And and where does this expertise come from? It's you're trained in a social work program that was basically designed by these public policy institutes in Western countries, and so from the age of 18 or whenever it is these people start studying this, they are taught a certain sort of they are taught a certain way of looking at problems, and there's a whole bunch of policy directives and standards that they are trained in, and so then when they come into the field, that's what they apply, and much of their job is about persuading the legislature and the executive arm of government to implement these. And so we're not just talking about just some jhola wala from JNU, okay? Because this jhola wala from JNU or whoever it may be, whether it's a jhola wala or whether it's some slick public policy professional from the Harvard School of Public Policy, they are basically speaking a language which is backed by UN and other huge multinational organizations. These are codes and standards of conduct that have been set by them, and their work is then funded by very, very credible and hugely popular billionaires and millionaires like Bill Gates and George Soros. So no individual, in this case me as a mother who comes completely, from a totally different field. I'm a retired corporate lawyer. Who thinks that this is very wrong, and that there's actually a real human rights crisis going on in the classic sense of human rights. You don't even get a hearing. Okay, so the kind of heft, if what Disha Ravi is facing, shows that the might of the state against her, and so unreasonable, and how is she to answer back? That unequal equation, and exists even in this field of activism, and it's not a fair fight at all, because initially when these arguments happened in the UN and in these other forums, you had, this was a genuine forum for discussion of different points of view, with, a particular sort of sensitivity to the fact that if we are going to have a global world, if there's going to be one world, then we also have to understand that there is a lot of diversity within that world. And so the newly formed nations which had emerged from colonialism must be given a space and a voice. And if you study the history, even if you take climate change, for instance, if you study how it evolved until, the 80s, well, maybe, or you take, for instance, population control discussions. There was a very substantive contribution that came from African, Asian, colored nations, which was rooted in their own context, and assumed, and wherever that assumption was forgotten, demanded that attention be paid to the fact that often what is considered to be the way forward, if in a Western context, is oppressive and damaging given our context. And so, to that extent, the United Nations served a good purpose, because the rules of the game were that, everybody has to be heard, and that there has to be, a substantive negotiation of these competing interests, to come up with these documents, such as the UN Charter for Human Rights and so on. But over a period of time, it has changed. And today, you're not having that exchange. What does it mean for Greta Thunberg, who's apparently an autistic teenager, who was, took a year out of school at 14 or 15 or whatever it was. She's going to the UN, and she's just screaming at them, tears rolling down her face. How dare you? How dare you? This is a very far cry from the kinds of, documentation, from the kinds of documents, interventions, and speeches that were given by, if you take the issue of population control, which was a very contentious sort of issue back in the 80s. You have substantive points being made, and a case is made, and then you have different countries coming together on what they see as a common interest. Even you often had people who weren't necessarily partners otherwise. You had actually a coalition among Middle Eastern countries and Catholic countries on the question of abortion and how it was to be viewed in the context of population control, to give you, an example. Now, obviously, if the UN is formally allowing this kind of exhibition of a Greta Thunberg coming and screaming at them, that whole way of functioning is gone. And all that you have today is this forced consensus. And who's leading the consensus? It's not even a person. It's a supercomputer. Okay, and that's supposed to be backed by these scientists, which nobody understands, all right? And the scientists keep talking about a consensus. The few who disagree are, vilified, and it's made very clear that they have to toe a certain line. And then behind them, you have this, young, generation of student activists from across the world. This is like this is the hierarchy of support. And so, this is not, this is a machine, okay? And it's in India. In the case of Disha Ravi, it's come up against the machine of the government. But she shouldn't be in jail, and but the people who are so agitated by it cannot afford to ignore the fact that these movements are no longer the spontaneous, rooted. It's not a people's movement. Okay, let me use the language of leftists. These movements are no longer people's movements. Okay, these are movements of a particular agenda around which there's a whole bunch of money, power, and so on that's backing it. And this is not good for democracy. It's not good for democracy anywhere, because it's trampling on those. because okay, let me put it this way. The constitution was there to help the small guy. Because so and there's a recognition that you can have the most benevolent government, but the structures of power are such that you need something to give a leg up to the guy who's just speaking as an individual. And for a long time, these activists and social workers and they made it a point to assist the small guy. But today they've also become the big guy. And I also feel that what's going on is also very unfair to these young people, because let's I mean the state. What is the state? The first rule of thumb of who is an authority in any polity is who has the power. So the state is the monopoly of power, and it's not just the monopoly of power, but it's the monopoly of violence in society. And so when you decide to rebel against the state, make no mistake. I mean, you are going against a very powerful, vicious machinery which exists to stamp you out. Okay, once you decide that you're in revolt. And this is not to say that you shouldn't do it, okay? But to the idea that young people have today, that, like you can just go out and demonstrate, and it's kind of like, going to, and that there is something, that you're not going to face this, raw power of the state. That's not an idea that we should be giving young people. It's not fair on them. If in India, activists say that they have never faced this kind of pushback until this government came to power, then I think that, they also have to question their own activism, because these powers were always with the state. And I don't just mean, sedition law. The fact that, you can use very small laws, like in Delhi, you can just use section 144 to arrest someone if they try and go and demonstrate anywhere other than a pavement in Janpath, right? So, if you were getting such an easy ride from the government before this one came into power, then you really do have to question what was the nature of your relationship with that government. And, how much in opposition were you truly? Okay? And, if you're going to be honest about it, I think that you're going to fundamentally find that at some point along the line, and I think, this was definitely true in the UPA government, the idea of there being an inherent opposition between the state and the individual was set aside for the new idea, which comes from this Western sort of ideology and training in public policy, that the state is the instrument of delivering beneficence and welfare and all good things to the people. This idea is teaching students that the state is basically your friend. And, it is in this spirit that these guys are going out so naively. I mean, some of them may not be. But if it is true that Disha Ravi's parents were, supporters of the right wing, I don't think that she has really, been sent into this without the armor. I'm not against, whether you're any kind of society, there will be activism of some kind. There will be dissidents, there will be opposing points of view, there will be points of view which are on the margins that have to go against the state in order to be heard, in order to prevail. That's all fine. But we also have a duty towards people who are younger than us, so for them to know exactly what it is that they are playing with. And, no student watching what's happened to Disha Ravi should abandon their ideals, okay, even if I don't agree. but they should not be under any apprehension that the kind of push, the kind of sort of the way the state comes slamming down on you is some kind of aberration, or that it just has something to do with Modi. Because don't forget that all the laws which are being used, are laws which have been on the books since before independence. Some of them, they haven't been moved. And Delhi is supposed to be a hub of activism. And, this idea of imposing Section 144 everywhere and not allowing any space in the capital of the country to really protest, this is not something that was invented by this government. So, where was the focus of activism? Why were these laws not questioned? And, if they weren't applied, what was the real dynamic that was going on? None of this is something that is very good for the pure politics, which is what protest should be about. And I believe that this is a country which can intuit this, because this was the message of Gandhi, that your means, you cannot, use your ends to justify your means, and that the form of your protest has to be as noble, and has to demonstrate actually whatever it is, whatever ideal it is that you're trying to persuade society to achieve, and that is the reason for peaceful protest. But today, with the big activist machine, peaceful protest has just become commodified. And and it's also that, of course, I don't understand why a toolkit is such a problem. So what if there was a toolkit? That's not seditious. That's the problem is, but the fact is that, you've just got this slick machine. Why should you need this toolkit? Toolkits and points, and that's what corporations have, that's what institutions have. That's the whole machinery of the establishment, that's the whole machinery of those who are in power. And if you're going to use these weapons, if you're going to use these means, you're never going to achieve anything but simply an agreement among those in power to whatever it is you're trying to say. And that's never going to be a happy agreement, because it's not a value-based way of moving forward. You're just going to come to some kind of cynical understanding. And you can see that in the climate movement. It's also superficial, like all this talk about electric cars and using wind and solar power. It's become a big money-making exercise. And there are people who are now demonstrating. Michael Moore did, that is creating as much pollution as anything else. And people like whoever is behind Greta Thunberg, they're completely insensitive. The Swedish per capita consumption of energy is 6 times more than the per capita consumption of energy of anyone in India. The assumption of the climate change movement is that there is only one form of consumption, which is the Western one, and that ultimately somehow that has to be preserved by doing all kinds of other things. Okay, but that already is a compromise with the powers that be. They wanted to keep consuming because that's how they make the money. So anyway, this is not a argument about climate change, but it's just there is such a thing as big activism, which has all the same structural problems in terms of being a closed circle that commands a lot of power, which does not come from the people, which does not come even from votes. Okay, and it suffers from the same hubris, lack of taking into account individual people's realities, ignoring in a racist way the compunctions and the differences that apply across different cultures. And there's every reason to oppose that. And if they are not going to play fair, I really don't know how long even people who don't want to see young students thrown into jail on sedition charges, I don't see how long they will be happy to play it fair either, because it's not fair. And I don't know why I mean, there's no reason for us to adopt this model of activism anyway. Okay, what has unfortunately happened in in a lot of these welfare state countries is that, the middle class, which actually sort of brings, the firepower to these kinds of movements, the intellectual power and so on, it has got completely co-opted. It's just got too rich. It can provide for itself, and it's quite happy with the way the status quo is going. Okay, so they are not really involved. Plus, they just don't have these huge populations to draw on. I've been working very closely with people who are on welfare, and I am their friend. Okay, I support them. Nobody speaks for them when their children are taken away, but they don't have the wherewithal to sustain any form of protest that will be effective. So, so there is a reason why protest and whatever, this lobbying for change has taken a certain form in the West. All this doesn't apply to India. We have crores of people, and they haven't been softened up. I mean, like, you catch anyone from Norway sitting like the farmers have for all these months out in the cold, in the heat. People in these countries have lost the ability to withstand all of that. Okay, it's just not the case for us, and it's not the case for anyone. I mean, anyone in the region. It's not because Indians are great. It's not the case for anyone in South Asia. It's not the case for anyone in Africa. We don't have to adopt this model. We don't have to adopt any model. But I think that, if you're going to be, people talk a lot about love and pure, the pureness of love and everything. Well, I think that there is also purity in activism. It is a very precious thing. And people who do it, who genuinely do it, I mean, this is a very brave step. And so, but it has to retain its purity. It should not be commodified. And all Indian students, whether you're from whatever community, whether you're a Hindu or whether you come from a minority community, whether you come from, a university or whatever it is, all of you, before you participate in these global movements, you really have to ask yourself whether they are being fair, in terms of the power that they bring versus what any other point of view could bring if it were to come from India. Okay, then the other thing I wanted to talk about was Disha, was this young woman at Oxford University who's had to resign. Okay. I mean, Oxford seems to have changed a lot from the time that I was there. I remember reading a while ago that there was another president who was forced to resign because he was accused of racism after a committee found that he had ejected someone from some meeting who was of a different race, and that that was a racist act and he had to resign or whatever. And so I mean, I don't know whether like all these people who've got in on the whole Oxford Union game are like part of this whole thing. In which case, they can just lie in the bed with the politics that they have created. But if that's not the case, and if you have the case of a bright, enthusiastic, energetic student, who's had the guts to go out there and as an Indian woman, she has stood and she has won. I mean, are we preparing our students for what they are going to face? Because I mean, who scrolled down her social media posts for so long to see what she had said? Okay, and who was it? I mean, if it was someone who was from the conservative, because I mean, she sort of announced that she came in on a ticket for fighting transphobia and homophobia in the university and all kinds of other radical feminist, causes. And so if it was someone from the other side of the political camp, then this was a very calculated, malicious and spiteful thing to do. And I mean, it's a total humiliation because if there were anything in her record that would disqualify her, firstly, it wouldn't be genuine, because if you don't agree with the point of view, then I don't know, how can you then force her to resign on grounds of her own politics? But but like, I mean, you could have she could have been vetted, and all of this could have been brought out when the campaign was going on. So, I mean, who is behind this, and has she been treated in the as fairly as other presidents have been when they've come under fire? I mean, the previous guy, I believe there was a committee, and there was findings, and there was not, to the best of my recollection, a unilateral resignation. Right? But the other thing is that suppose this did not come from someone on the other side of the political line, from this young woman, and it was someone who was also a leftist, radical feminist, cultural Marxist, whatever it is. I mean, I think that anybody looking at this has to ask themselves, how is anything helped in that case by going after someone like this? It's cannibalizing the cause. But I don't care much about the cause, because I don't really believe in this particular way of presenting the problems that we have in our society with gender or sexuality. But setting that aside, what do you achieve? I mean, if you go into this completely naively, thinking that you're there and you're fighting for radical feminism, you're now resigning on a charge of racism. Okay, that's a very black tag to carry for the rest of your life. And at least for the, initial working years, I don't know what you're even going to do. Because even, jobs which have nothing to do with activism, like at least not directly, like corporate law or chartered accountancy or whatever, it's pretty difficult to get hired if you've been called a racist and admitted that you were a racist. And it's also, I mean, if somebody is an enthusiastic, budding politician who's out there, I mean, this is the worst kind of introduction you can give to her. And, I mean, so either this whole way of looking at things, if you're a student deciding, how you're going to sort of present yourself and what your politics is going to be, you've got to ask yourself, like, are you finding a community of interest, or is it just a bunch of hyenas that you're jumping into? All right, and if you're not, I mean, if you're well aware of what the game is, then you're already someone who's not going to be employable or absorbable in any other field except for big machine activism. In which case you've got money power, you've got a whole, you've got institutional power. You don't have the police and the army, but you have got everything else that the state uses against the individual in a just cause, okay? And I don't see any reason why you should be supported. If you're out there playing this very, very strategic, calculated game, don't cry when you're thrown into jail. That's what it's about. Okay, see you guys. Hope that gave you something to think about.